Welcome back. You're watching Morning Express. Let's take a look at this story where more than 10,000 residents of Chakama area in Magarini constituency, Kilifi County, are protesting against massive destruction of crops by elephants and hippos in their farms. The rogue elephants and hippos have allegedly been destroying crops since February this year, causing losses amounting to millions. But locals claim the Kenya Wildlife Service has always kept a deaf ear to their cries. Ashley Mazuri with this report.
Residents of Magarini feel they are staring at hunger due to the destruction done by elephants, with no help from the authorities. On a tour to the areas affected by human-wildlife conflicts, journalists came face to face with the destruction as the rogue wildlife descended on cassava, maize plantation, bananas, and even coconut trees. Normally, the elephants are reportedly moving in groups of between 5 and 20 and are notorious in destruction more than the hippos, who only destroy crops in farms near the river. This has now forced some farmers to either harvest their crops early or spend the night guarding their farms without any weapon, as they cannot fight the elephants. When they spot the elephants, they light bonfires and beat drums or pieces of iron sheets to scare the animals away. According to Samson Zia, one of the affected farmers who has a 3-acre farm, residents came together to try to help each other as the destruction is getting worse, claiming that response of Malindi KWS is wanting.
Hizi ripoti tukizipeleka kwa wahusika, hasa sisi tuko katika Kilifi County, ambao Kilifi County iko na maaskari wake, lakini response ya upande wa Malindi iko very poor. Kwa sababu gani? Tukiwapigia simu wanasema kwamba gari ziko grounded, hazina mafuta, ama wanasema kwamba gari imeenda Sabaki kushughulikia mambo ya kiboko, gari imeenda Garashi kushughulikia mambo ya nyati. Vitu vingi wanakuwekea hapa, lakini sisi hapa mkaaji wa hapa Chakama, mtu analalamika kila kukicha. Hapa mwananchi ndio anapigia sehemu ya Taita Taveta, ambako sasa iko Taita Taveta county, ambao wengine wako hapa Salagate, ambao ndio ambao wanatusaidia huku.
Areas that have been affected by wildlife are Bakaye, Mchekenzi, Ruruma, Katana Hekeye, Kwamwanza, Bombi, Garisemke, Divayo, Habura, Hawewanje, Kibora, Kanduru, Adimae, Katama, Bofu, Shakahola, Majengo, among others. Residents claim KWS officers are quick to arrest people found with dik-diks or respond to death caused by elephants, but will never come in to help end the destruction in farms, and called on the government to intervene. The problem is so dire that some children have stopped going to school.
Imebainika wazi kwamba Wizara ya Wanyamapori haiko tayari kutatua swala hili. Na baada ya kuongea mara kwa mara, kuandika barua kwa waziri mhusika na kutopata suluhu kutoka kwao, nikapeleka hili swala bungeni. Nakumbuka Waziri Balala alipokuja bungeni mbele ya kamati, aliahidi kwamba swala hili atalipatia kipaumbele, aone ni vipi atasaidia watu wa Chakama location ili kuhakikisha kwamba ndovu ama viboko, hippopotamus hawezi kuendelea kuhangaisha wananchi.
Now, when contacted, KWS Malindi Marine National Park and Reserve Deputy Warden said he was not aware of the matter and hung up the phone. Magarini Member of Parliament Michael Kingi said he has tried to intervene personally by supporting the KWS with fuel and vehicle, but still nothing has come up to end the destruction.
Na hili swala la gomvi baina ya wanadamu na wanyama unalijua vizuri sana ndani ya Chakama location, ndani ya Magarini location. Tumempoteza maisha ya watu. Watoto wanakosa kwenda shule, hasa ndovu wanapotoka kwa wingi. Mimi nakuomba ya kwamba ujitokeze mahali uko ili uje ushughulikie swala hili la ndovu na hippos na pamoja na wanyamapori ambao linaathiri sana maisha ya watu wa Chakama.
Area residents are now staring at hunger and human-wildlife conflicts if the situation is not addressed. Ashley Mazuri, KTN News.
So as you can see, resolving human-wildlife conflict is definitely of the utmost priority, even as we call for preservation of the ecosystem. We want to have a conversation centered on this, and I'm joined in studio by Dickson Kaelo, who's the CEO of the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association. I'm also joined by Elijah Keen Naini, who's the Olgulului Olarashi Group Ranch representative. Gentlemen, many thanks for your time. And I'd like to just perhaps reflect on that particular story that was voiced by our reporter Ashley Mazuri, highlighting on the human-wildlife conflict. And at times, the response is wanting. So Dickson, from where you sit, what precipitates such conflict between humans and animals, and how best can we sort it going forward?
Thank you very much for having me. And today we are discussing a relatively very emotive and important subject, the subject of human-wildlife conflict. And I think often we focus more on the symptoms of the problem and not really what are the drivers. And I think I would like to just point out a few drivers to this problem. Top on the list is the fact that we are having changing weather patterns. Climate change is impacting areas that wildlife, and especially migratory ones, are using. We are having less rains in some places, and even when we have enough rains, the rain seems to be concentrated around short seasons. They are not as spread as we used to, and indeed we do get sessions of flooding. And as a result, some of the areas that are used by the wildlife are becoming either degraded, eroded, or declining in habitat quality. And that forces some of the wildlife to move further into other places. I think a second driver is the fact that I think Kenya is recording quite some remarkable success in wildlife conservation. We are seeing wildlife numbers after years, about 4 decades of declines. A combination of the work of the Kenya Wildlife Service through the national parks and the community conservancies is really bearing fruits. And we're beginning to see populations of some wildlife beginning to take an upward or a stable trend. And of course, as the numbers of wildlife grow, their needs to use and survive in some areas also grows. But this is not only a problem emanating from the wildlife side, it's also a human induced situation where increasingly as we have more and more populations moving into the marginal areas, Kenya is having 1 million perhaps children every other year, and as we've had just now, there is always a desire to own land and a desire to move into new areas. And so human population is moving into areas that traditionally were used by wildlife, and they are moving at a time where most of those that are moving into these places are not conversant with how to live with wildlife. Our pastoral communities had devised traditional ways of surviving with wildlife, and they knew how to avoid wildlife and what to do in what areas. But traditionally, this is changing as more and more populations move into the rangelands, and as more of the young people move into areas that traditionally were left open by the local communities, we see encounters increasing, and hence we see cases of human-wildlife conflict escalating in some of our regions.
Okay, that's well noted. Let's bring in Elijah Keen, because perhaps this is where group ranches play a part in terms of coexistence between the wildlife and the humans, of course, because we all have this space to share. So how do we coexist, and what impact are these group ranches playing in terms of resolving or ridding us of this human-wildlife conflict?
Thank you very much for having me. And as you had indicated, that I run the biggest group ranch in Kenya called Olgulului Olarashi Group Ranch in Loitoktok, and I can tell you that when you talk about the numbers, this year alone we have lost 6 lives. We have lost 1,000 herds of animals, cattle and goats. And this is because the group ranch has been surrounded by the park. As a matter of fact, the park emanated out of our willingness to support, and we gave out this land for the national park.
Okay.
And it is a problem, and going forward, the problem will escalate further because right now we are subdividing the land. We have done 90% of the land, and we are expecting that the humans will come more closer to the park. That is not to say that we are not doing something about it. So as a group ranch, we have set aside biggest tracts of land, like Orgului Group Ranch. We have set aside 120,000 acres of land that is surrounding the park, that we have created buffer zone conservation areas that we have created to enable the free movement of wildlife. And as we have done this, we need also KWS and other partners to come and partner with us and do adequate compensation of this land, because it is not for free. We need to adequately get compensated so that this wildlife can have some space going forward into the future. Because if we do not do this, then I can assure you that the Amboseli National Park is going to collapse.
Exactly, and protecting the ecosystem is quite important. So still with you, Elijah, you've talked about subdivision of this land, and I know land is quite an emotive subject, especially in this country. How exactly does land subdivision within group ranches occur in order to have a clear out buffer zone, as you've mentioned, that will also favor the animals that might be affected with the increase in human population in this area?
We have defined a well thought of subdivision plan that has created enormous tract of land for wildlife, and at the same time giving the members an opportunity to develop the land. And previously, people have been living like squatters on their own land in favor of wildlife. And this is why we are saying that it is about time that this must change. And you can see that the Group Ranches Act that was recently repealed to community land forced us to subdivide the land so that eventually we don't lose the land to other sectors. So, but I can say that this subdivision has balanced the economy, such that tourism has been catered, and as well as livelihood catered. And I think going forward with the creation of this buffer zone and along the parks,
okay,
we also have corridors that we have created that comes all the way from Tanzania, and they go all the way to the Tsavo National Park. So in actual sense, the routes that this wildlife have been using ever since immemorial, we have created and set aside. And this is what we are emphasizing, that KWS and other partners must partner with the local community so that these people can get compensated for this land. Because if this is not going to happen, then we're going to open the land for development.
Okay,
Yeah.
We'll get to talk about that. But Dixon, from where you sit, this wildlife corridors are at times under threat due to, human interactions and all that. So as the Wildlife Conservancies Association, how do you ensure that this balance in the ecosystem prevails, that we do not encroach too much and the same doesn't happen, and there will be, humans will definitely react if their crops or livestock are destroyed? Talk to us about this.
At the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, we recognize the value of our natural resource, our wildlife, our water areas, our trees, and the many other microorganisms that in many ways we rely on and sometimes we don't necessarily appreciate. If you think of the value of natural resources in our country, you actually realize that more than up to 70% of our job creation depends on natural resources in one way or the other. And more than nearly half of our economy also relies on the natural resources that we have. So we first of all work to engage our own local communities in their different areas. First of all, to demystify the perceptions that wildlife conservation is about keeping some areas closed and creating wildlife-only areas, and then creating human areas, and that they should be kept distinct. That's not Africa. Africa, and especially Kenya, as the cradle of humankind, has a long history of coexistence, where people and wildlife shared space. And respectively so, and that's why we continue, despite the challenges, to have one of the most strong wildlife industry and tourism industry as such, which generates quite some significant contribution to our GDP. We do this by bringing our members around a concept we call the Wildlife Conservancy. Only recently recognized under the Wildlife Act in 2013. Prior to that, conservation was just about national parks and reserves, failing to recognize that more than 3/4 of our wildlife do need to move out and actually reside in community areas. And so a conservancy as a concept is basically a local institution that manages land in a way that includes conservation objectives. We bring together the community within an area, they organize themselves, they register legal entity, and they create plans.
Okay.
And planning is what has been lacking. County spatial plans, ecosystem plans, and also the national planning process is what is perhaps the most important way of addressing human-wildlife conflict. And so these conservancies, of course, are focusing on the needs of people and the needs of wildlife, and trying to balance that. And it's a very delicate and long objective. So we work to encourage a policy framework that recognizes these conservancies, that incentivizes them. Currently, we are working with the Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife to create a national fund that will support human-wildlife conflict mitigation strategies, because the whole industry, wildlife industry, receives significantly less budget allocation from the exchequer than other sectors, and yet it's one of the most important sector for the country, and so we try to bring to light these facts so that we see more investment from government, more targeted investment from the private sector going into the conservancies and generating the benefits that will then justify why people would want to survive with some of these dangerous animals.
Okay, so when we talk about benefits of surviving with these dangerous animals, Elijah, is there goodwill when it comes to compensation? Because this is an equally emotive subject right now. From the government, from the relevant agencies, do they walk the talk?
Thank you for asking that, and I think we need to put the record straight that so far we have lost 13 lives in the Amboseli ecosystem. And the compensation, we have only been compensated by one person. We have so many of brothers and sisters that are maimed. We have lost countless number of livestock. We have lost huge tracts of land, crops within the ecosystem, and none has been compensated. So it is about time that the KWS and other partners must wake up to the reality that this compensation ought to be. And it is remembered and it is documented even in Parliament that every person that should be killed by a wild animal must be compensated by 5 million shillings. And this has only been a mirage. So I can say that there is no goodwill at all. So this is about time that they need to walk the talk and get us compensated.
So Dixon, at times response is wanting from where he sits. How do we resolve this as you finalize your final comment?
Yeah, compensation is only one way of trying to manage human-wildlife conflict. And indeed, it's been a challenge to our communities to receive compensation. Mainly it's been done for human life, but largely for crops and other loss of property. It's been wanting. And the big obstacle to that is adequate allocation of funding to the compensation program. So that's the action that needs to be taken. But I don't think that that's going to be the only solution. If communities themselves can organize themselves and build conservancies that generate revenue for themselves, and we are seeing conservancies using tourism, using carbon, using other enterprises to generate their own revenue, then that will then provide an incentive for which the costs of living with wildlife can be offset. And I think that's the more viable route that we need to venture in. And I think we are beginning to venture into that route, and we are beginning to see some of the conservancies actually generating enough revenue that if you lost your cow to a lion, you actually can earn an income at the end of the month or a quarter to buy a cow to replace that. So then it becomes unnecessary to counter-attack the wildlife. And I think that's the direction as a country would like to go through.
Okay, well noted. Elijah, just briefly, you're doing a very good job in terms of protecting this ecosystem around the Amboseli National Park. Your final comment, even as you've highlighted the challenges, but it's not all gloom, surely, right?
Yeah. Well, my final comment is that the tourism sector or the management of wildlife within the Amboseli and other pastoral communities needs to start from the bottom. It has to be people inclusive. We have to run it from down there, and we need to have the paradigm shift from running these organizations in the suburbs of Karen and even in the cities of London. And I can say that it is important that we run these organizations from the bottom, because we have seen a lot of exploitation that these people have come in to run these tracts of land, and in return, they are selling carbon to the international community, and yet we do not have compensation in terms of getting adequate income for the same land that has been given out for leasing. Thank you.
So those affected should be adequately involved in this whole process. Gentlemen, many thanks for your time. This is an ongoing conversation. We've just scratched the surface, so we'll definitely continue monitoring the status of the human-wildlife engagement. I won't use the word conflict. Gentlemen, thanks for your time. Dixon Kaelo, CEO, Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, and Elijah Keen Naini, who's from the Olgulului Olarashi Group Ranch, and he's a representative from there. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Allow us to finalize on that particular note for our viewers back at home. We've come to the tail end of Morning Express. Many thanks for watching.